Let's continue talking about racism. I'm mindful of the fact that as a white male, I probably don't come across as someone who has many experiences with racism. And for obvious reasons, that's true. I don't have a lot of experiences with racism. I do have experiences, maybe one or two, where the color of my skin and my gender clearly conditioned how somebody else was treating me. And I have experiences with this idea of being colonized in a more economic sense or maybe a political sense. But realistically, I don't have the kinds of experiences that the two people we're going to be talking about today. My experiences are quite a bit different than theirs. Frantz Fanon, I'm going to say Fanon unfortunately, but it's Frantz Fanon and his work, The Wretched of the Earth, and Glen Coulthard, his work, Red Skins, White Masks. Fanon will argue, and I don't agree with him, but I'm going to try and give him the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to try, and shake out his argument as best possible. He's going to argue that for true equality to happen, we need extreme violence, like gratuitous, the worst kind of violence. A war here, a war there, that's not what he's talking about. Very much a terrorist kind of violence is necessary to achieve a true revolt, a true revolution, kind of like French Revolution gratuitous violence stuff. We're going to talk about that. And then we're going to talk about Glen Coulthard's Red Skin, White Masks, in which he speaks from the perspective of an indigenous person trying to understand, is reconciliation between the dominant, largely what we would describe as a capitalist culture, Fanon uses the idea of a capitalist culture, is reconciliation between the dominant group and the indigenous population or First Nations, is it possible? And he comes out on the pessimist side, that as it sits, as people commonly think of it, it's not going forward positively, and it can't go forward positively unless we do a few things first, unless we rethink the situation. So that's where we're going on Racism Part 2, essentially asking, what does decolonization look like? Does it require violence? Is it even possible without violence? And is reconciliation possible in the modern context? So what might decolonization look like? What might it mean for people to free itself, to find equality, to find liberty? What's involved in that? What's the mechanism or process? I've been taught since a very young age that the process is one that is peaceful, that involves dialogue and conversation, that involves people having a preliminary sense of equality, in the sense that two people can come together and actually talk. That is, you are worth talking to, so let's talk and let's figure this out. That presupposes equality that Fanon is going to say doesn't exist. So the whole idea of peace or equality coming about because of conversation is wildly overlooking the point of radical inequality built into it all. It's also overlooking the hypocrisy of the powers that be that say they want equality and say they want to talk, but really all of that talk is a stall tactic so they can keep extracting resources and taking and using and abusing, all the while paying lip service to real equality. And so the conversation isn't a real conversation, the dialogue is fake, and the inequality is perpetuated. So what does decolonization look like? Not talk. It looks and involves at least violence, extraordinary violence. I was taught from the very beginning, we've all been taught probably not to hit other kids, not to be throwing things, not to call people bad names. Violence of any kind is frowned upon. Why? Because we expect people to have a conversation, to think through things logically, rationally, to negotiate, to find some kind of compromise, a middle ground. But again, all of these things also start with some sense of equality, some preliminary sense that you are a human being and I owe you something and you owe me something. We can have a reciprocal relationship. But Fanon, I keep saying Fanon, but I want to say Fanon in my head. Fanon looks at this and he says, look, below the surface, it looks like that, it sounds like that, we're all kind of trying to get along. But that's not the situation. And we know it's not the situation because of the radical inequalities that still exist. Economic, political, you name it. And we're going to hear a little bit of this as well from Coulthard, who says This whole conversation about reconciliation between peoples in Canada, that too is an example of talk without any real substance, without real connection, without real human seeing eye to eye, talking heart to heart kind of thing. So the question, is it possible for an enslaved people, an aggrieved people, subjected people, people that have been denied equal rights, equal status, equality of employment, you name it, is it possible for enslaved people to be free without violence? His answer is going to be no. And that's scary. If that's true, that's scary. And again, I don't really agree with him myself, but I find his analysis persuasive. I find his thinking that this is why inequality continues to this day, because the talk hasn't worked. However, I think that we have made progress. I think we've made a great deal of progress, and often without the need for violence. He will counter-argue, and he will say that there may be some concessions, there may be some placation to the masses, but at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, especially when the average person or the enslaved person comes for the money, comes for the stuff of the people in power, then you will see their true colors, metaphorically speaking. Then you will see their true spirit, their true heart, which is dark and angry and evil, and they will kill you rather than really give you access to stuff, their stuff. So we'll get back to that. Violence is necessary for equality, is his argument. Fanon was born in Martinique, a French colony, to a middle-class family. He received a very prestigious education, becoming a psychologist. That's pretty awesome. He was able to become a physician of sorts, and obviously having some kind of education gave him breadth of insight, but also his personal experiences. As a colored person, he understood firsthand the implications of being in a colonized context. At one point became involved with the Algerian Liberation Front, which by all accounts would be considered a terrorist group by our standard definitions today. So there's Algeria. It had been, the French had gone there to colonize it, and the Algerians were saying, hey, we don't want you here, go. And of course, politics doesn't work, and asking them to rewrite laws, of course, that wouldn't work. And so the Liberation Group would smuggle bombs into cafes and cinemas. They would go after the average person. Right? Terrorism 101. How could we possibly support that? This is a part of a much larger conversation about the nature of terrorism, what some people call terrorism, other people call warriors. It's justified because it's the only means that they have at their disposal. I can't get my head wrapped around that. I can't see that as a viable alternative, but the notion, at least part of the counter-argument here to the idea that terrorists are just bad, is that the French that were there, that wasn't their country. The people, while they were citizens, they weren't innocent because they were a part of a system that was exploitive and all these different things. So they were combatants of some kind regardless. Sure, they may not have been military personnel wearing a soldier's uniform or something like that, but still they weren't considered innocent. And so, again, I'm trying to get my head into this headspace, which I can't do, but therefore the innocent people that were blowing up with bombs aren't innocent after all. Right? I'm sure that's a traditional or standard logic for most terrorists. People who look innocent aren't, therefore, XYZ, we treat them as we would however we want. One of the things that's frustrating about this conversation is not only that I'm a white male trying to talk about racism, for which I have very little experience whatsoever, but Fanon recognizes that, in fact, many people who are going to be reading his book or having this conversation come from countries in which the countries are already colonized. That is, they're the second or third generation after that act of colonization. So they don't have a first-hand experience or first-hand account of the divisiveness or the tension and the stress. He talks about capitalist cultures that have kind of smoothed out the inequalities through all kinds of different things, education, our moral compass, how we teach morality, social conventions, how our rewards and punishments work, an appeal to respect for social order, whether maybe we get the youth, the young in school to sing the national anthem, or we fly flags. I remember one of the first times, half of my family is American, and one of the first times we went to the US, I was surprised to see all the flags lining the houses on the streets. This is an example of patriotism, or a sense of shared space, shared something, shared values. And so in capitalist cultures, there's this sense of equality of sharing. We can all fly the flag, we can all sing the song, we can all be a part of these educational. It's required in Canada to have a certain amount of education. A truancy, it's a criminal offense not to find yourself in education or some substantial alternative. In other words, in capitalist countries, the inequality has a number of mechanisms to make it look more equal. Because clearly there's inequality in capitalism, but there are these mechanisms or things at work that make us feel like, at the end of the day, it may not be perfect, but at least it's tolerable. So compound that we've had generations of being taught that we're all more or less equal, that we don't have firsthand experiences of actually ourselves having rifles and sending people off their land. Then it becomes very, very hard to have a conversation about decolonization, because the actual colonization doesn't make sense to most of us. Now in Canada, there are many people who have a very vivid sense of what it means, especially immigrants that come from overseas, and they're in countries right now where their generation has been exploited firsthand. They feel it. Of course, there are other forms of colonization that we've already been discussing. It doesn't need to be more of that traditional land invasion. There are other forms. Still, at the end of the day, his argument is we're almost, I don't want to say doomed, but it's very difficult for us to really get a sense of why the violence would be necessary, because we don't really feel the situation for what it is. And if that's his argument, if his argument is, hey, listen, white guy, you can't possibly understand firsthand, or even from family history, you can't possibly understand the situation because you are fortunate and lucky, then it makes me wonder, how do I engage this argument? How do I engage the idea that violence is absolutely necessary for equality? Maybe I can't. And this is one of the very few arguments in all of my studies where I kind of sit back and I go, well, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know where to go with that, because I think he's right to a large degree. I don't understand, I can't understand. And it's like the rich person trying to understand the life of the poor person. If I'm a rich person, I'm Jeff Bezos, I'm a billionaire, I'm going to be tone deaf to the needs of people who are starving. Okay, I don't know Jeff Bezos, just talk about me. I'm probably going to be tone deaf, especially if I'm storing billions of dollars in my gold vaults, right? I'm tone deaf in some way. So let's just accept that as a given, that there's a disconnect now between the experiences of people who would feel and say, yes, violence is the right recourse, and the experiences of the rest of us who have been taught since we were young that violence is not appropriate, that while the system might not be perfect, having a conversation and talking and having a meeting of the minds, sharing of the heart, that this is progress. He largely denies that. He largely denies that that's possible. The system is unequal. We've been taught to talk. The problem is talking has just been an excuse for people with power to keep getting away with what they want. What we need is a forced redistribution of wealth. What we need for real equality is to force people who are maybe saying nice things, maybe placating, and we're going to find the best way, we're going to make the situation better. We just have to force them. Because, and fair enough, if we look back just a little bit, just step back a little bit and ask who has most of the wealth. So this is a related topic, but it's certainly an economic topic. But it's an economic topic, who has the most wealth, very much connected with how do we attribute worth to people. But who has the most wealth? And the wealth, if we have, let's say I have in my hand all the gold, all the diamonds, all the property in the world. I have all the wealth right here in my hand. And now I'm going to distribute it to the world. How is it flowing out? Where is it going? And what we see is that you've heard about the 1%ers. They're getting more and more and more of the fixed wealth. They're getting more and more and more. And it's not changing anytime soon. And in fact, some of the numbers seem to imply that within this generation, 99% of the wealth will be owned by the 1%, the fewer and the fewer and the fewer. What does that mean? That means that economic equality, actual asset equality, is clearly not working at all. Right? Jeff Bezos, I'm picking on the guy, but he's probably going to be the world's first trillionaire. Nobody should be a trillionaire, right? If you have that kind of income coming in, you should be taking care of the people who are starving. You should be redistributing it, but they don't. They don't. And in fact, it was 2018, 2019, I don't remember, Amazon paid less in taxes than I did. The argument could be made that Amazon is producing employment and goods and services. They paid less taxes than I did. That is a sign of radical inequality. What is it going to take for the trillionaires and the billionaires and the multi-millionaires to give up their money? Fanon argues they're not going to do it out of the graciousness of their heart. And if we buy the topic or the talk that they're good-hearted or they're redistributing wealth in some way, then we've just bought into that party line and we're perpetuating inequality. Now, in terms of the colonial spirit or the colonial attitude, the same thing applies there. It's going to have to be forced. People aren't going to come to this epiphany of goodness and charity and do it automatically. It's been forever, years and years and years. We're going to have to force it. That too, I kind of agree with. That too, that makes sense. But how do we force it? How do we force the people to be good, right? To care about other people, color of their skin, but also whether they have food on the table. How do we force people to care? I don't see violence as the answer, but that's where he's going. Extraordinary violence. The colonial world is split into two. There's the native and the settler town, the ways of go to a rich town, go to a rich neighborhood rather, drive by, but be careful because you'll drive by some of these and you'll see a guard with a gun or some other device. I've seen this firsthand. I don't remember where I was. It must have been in the US somewhere because in Canada you'd have a hard time finding a guard except in very exceptional circumstances who's armed. Anyway, they're out in front of homes with big gates, very tall walls, protected communities, gated communities, you've heard the term. They're the haves. They're the people with the power. And then you probably don't have to drive very far and you find the have-nots. So here's an example. I live in a neighborhood where the average house price, well, it's more than doubled in the last 10 years. I literally could not afford to live in my own neighborhood if I had to buy this house again. My wife and I, we could not afford to live here. But a 10-minute drive from here, we get to a very rich reserve, one of the richest reserves in all of Canada. So we can go to the First Nations community, and we do this fairly often. We actually there's a restaurant there that we like to go to. And when you drive onto the reserve, things look different. They always look. Since I was a child, I remember there's another reserve very close to where I was in high school, and the very few times that we would drive to the reserve, it was different. It had that sort of quintessential, this is going to sound negative, I don't mean it to, but I'm just trying to be as honest as possible, the shanty town, the unkept lawns, the dogs running around that aren't on leashes, and weirdly colored homes, and everything was run down. And for every 25 houses that looked like they were run down, there was a surprisingly rich looking house. It was very nice. And the rest were just falling apart. And it was weird. Just driving on the highway, and you could see the haves and the have-nots, the native town, the settler town, the colonized, the colonizer. And I didn't know what to do with that. Obviously, I knew that was negative, but there was always a sense that when we were driving through the reserve that it was this lawless place and to be mindful of it. How do we fix that? But obviously, these issues are incredibly complex. And obviously, this needs to be fixed. It's not just the wealthy millionaires in California and then the average person. It's everywhere. The division between these two worlds, a colonial world split into two zones. The settler town, or the haves town, is strong. brightly lit. Garbage disappears, right? When you put garbage in the street, it's gone. Asphalt streets. Again, imagine the homes with flags. It's strange in Canada. We don't really fly flags in the front of our homes, and I'm not sure why, but it's a different sense of nationality. But still, there's a sense of shared space and shared park grounds and these sorts of things. By contrast, the native town, as he discusses it, is, I want to say, ill repute. It's the place where the criminals are, where the moral code is different. I'm trying to think of all these negative connotations that we could put on it. There's no open spaces. It's crowded. There aren't nice asphalt streets. And in fact, when we drive to the reserve, that's very much the case. The roads themselves are of a different quality and different size. They're not as well done. The social services aren't there. The signs aren't there to tell you where you're going, what you're doing. It's obviously just a different place between the haves and the have-nots. I'm generalizing. Obviously, I'm generalizing. But his observations seem to be largely true, that these two ways of living are present in the same country, in the same state, in the same province. They're present at the same time. And if it's true that we have these two things, that's not equality. So why is that happening? Why is that still happening so long after people started talking about having some sense of equality or liberty or freedom? After laws have been changed that guarantee people equality before the law, that human rights became a conversation, why aren't the roads all the same? Why don't people have the reserve close to me? My understanding, and correct, you can Google this, whatever reserve is close to you, they don't even have running water in half the homes. And it's one of the wealthiest ones going. I've just heard this. I don't know this is true. I've heard health services talking about this as an issue. Not just clean water, running water is still an issue in Canada. Of course, national news has been made year after year about clean water being an issue. How can this be? Because Fanon is right. The inequality still exists. It's still there. It's not fair. And when a modern culture has the wealth that we do, and there are people without clean running water, who's the savage? Who's the savage if that's true? Part of the issue is that when people begin to see, oh, that's a poor neighborhood, crime is at a higher crime rate, it's becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy that that's who they are and that's how they must always be. There's no impetus to say, well, they don't need to be like that, and if we stop exploiting them, we stop using them, we stop making it hard for them to get employment, it won't be like that. When you look at somebody who is wearing a hoodie, has dark skin, and is walking down the street, what do you think? And if you saw me, light-skinned with a hoodie, walking down the street, what would you think? Now imagine these two people, both wearing hoodies, living their whole lives being told, or hearing, or just assuming, but usually correctly, how people think of them, how people assume they are, how people expect them to act. In my case, if I'm wearing a hoodie, it's probably cold. And I'm walking down the street and you know, people, honestly, I wear a hoodie quite often actually, when I don't have a baseball cap on, keep the sun off, whatnot. No one has ever bat an eyelash because they could see the neighborhood I was in and the color of my skin. But you change my neighborhood and you change the color of skin, and of course, people have these different ideas. Are we as a culture then both creating, enforcing, and just being these stereotypes? Are we enslaved to ideas that we don't challenge? And are those ideas enslaving others? And I think the answer is obviously yes. I think the answer is clearly yes. Not only do we need to challenge our own ideas, we need to challenge them in a way that allows others to be free in a meaningful way. That is some sense of equality. That is a sense of freedom. Certainly Fanon does not think we've achieved, and rightly so. because it clearly is something that remains a problem. This mechanism of Orientalism is at work in this entire process of maintaining inequality right here. It's not Orientalism where we just look east and say, those people are bad. It's the people across the street from us don't fit. Equality means overcoming that weird process, that weird, convoluted, corrupting Orientalist spirit. Fanon argues that from the very beginning, the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, between the haves and the have-nots, between white and black, from the very beginning, that relationship has been marked by violence. Guns, bayonets, cannons, bad stuff, right, from the very beginning. And in the very least, it's hypocritical for those people in power now to say, oh, no violence, violence is bad, when they've created a situation of the fires of violence that favors them. It's also obviously hypocritical that they see these others as animals, as all the negative things, stereotypes that come with that Orientalist attitude, when they themselves are the ones who first treated and saw the other as an animal, never as an equal. Put it another way. If I came to you and I was immediately dismissive and hostile, and I saw you as a terrible human being, and I just set up a whole system that favored me and exploited you, you would have a hard time with that. But who's the animal in doing that? I am. I'm treating you in a terrible way because my values and my beliefs are screwed up. I'm the weirdo, right? In that context, I'm the animal. The settler and the native sees the settler as the one who's the animal, whereas the person who thinks they're enlightened and superior, they see the other, but they're the ones creating the situation of diminishing the other. And so the person with the power feels justified in perpetuating the atrocities, perpetuating the bad things, because this other person is an animal. And the irony is, just as we saw with Freud and as we discussed with Orientalism, they're actually the source of the violence and the devaluing and the dehumanization. Pardon my language, but what the hell do I do when everybody sees me as a bad guy? Everybody sees me as a gangster. And if I walk down the wrong neighborhood with a hoodie on, I get arrested. What do I do in a world where everyone's telling me I'm an animal or somehow less than, when I know I'm not? I'm not. But I also know that they kind of are because of how they're treating everybody else and how they're acting. What do I do? What rational conversation, what dialogue should I expect from these people? I shouldn't expect a rational conversation or dialogue. I shouldn't expect them to suddenly wake up and be human with me as a human. And so at that point, if that's true, I am left with very few options. If I've lived that way for a month, a year, 10 years, if it's a multi-generational discrimination in which people just do not see me as human, what do I do? Fanon argues, well, you really only have one option, and that's to get violent. A quote from Fanon. The settler is white. The settler is white. That's a Freudian slip. The settler is right when he speaks of knowing them well. It is the settler who brought the native into existence and who perpetuates his existence as a vengeful, angry, violent creature. I'll say that again. It is the settler, he's right, the colonizers, they're right. When he speaks of knowing them, the person being oppressed, enslaved, whatever, it is the settler who brought that native into existence. That is deep. And who perpetuates his existence as a vengeful, angry, violent creature. Isn't this just kind of pointing? Isn't this kind of scapegoating? It's your fault. I'm vengeful. It's your fault. I'm angry. It's your fault. I'm an animal. Well, no, it's not. Be careful, because the native isn't an animal. They may be angry and vengeful for different reasons, but they're not the one with terrible values that wants to exploit and enslave others. So you got to look for that subtlety here. To complete the quote, the settler also owes the fact of his existence, his property, to the colonial system. Decolonization must mean the destruction of the settlers because they can only exist as such through the continuation of colonialism. End quote. So the last sentence again. Decolonization must mean the destruction of the settlers. Fanon agrees that those who've been exploited and enslaved want the stuff, the wealth. They want it. And he agrees that they should. They made this stuff, right? You didn't get a Jeff Bezos on his own. He needed to exploit the labor of millions, hundreds of thousands of other people. And you didn't get a country like South Africa by being charitable to everybody else. The white people exploited the slave class. And so you need to destroy that system to free the people. By destroying it, literally, destroying it in that sense that people gain real equality, means sometimes that the people who are have-nots go and they take the stuff, the forced redistribution. It's tempting to say, oh, those poor people, they're just jealous. Those poor people, they just want the stuff that we rightly own. Well, no, they're jealous. Of course they are. Why wouldn't they be? And the stuff you rightly own, you don't rightly own, because that's not equality. The basis of it is born of inequality, unfairness, not theft and robbery in the traditional sense, but this continual exploitation. So there's a misunderstanding now on behalf of the settler, who both calls the other an animal, reinforces that self-fulfilling prophecy of you are bad, and probably legitimately begins to believe I deserve what I have. And they don't. And so violence is a restoration of an equilibrium that would not possibly exist if we relied on the thinking and the good kind-heartedness of those in power. Violence provides a means of creating an equilibrium or a balancing, a correction, which includes a forced redistribution of wealth that would not happen otherwise, because it is the very thinking of the settler to always see the other as less than. You cannot have equality if that's true. Okay. In response to the violence, the instinct of culture and those in power is to soothe, to placate, to give tokens, to try and calm the situation. They've already spent years trying to convince us that violence in any form is bad, so they have that going in their best interests. They have the promise of reason. That's supposed to be in their best interest, getting us to reason together. Moderation, nonviolence, these are compromising. These are forms of capitulation for Fanon. You just can't get ahead following those values. You just can't get ahead because the whole system is set up in their favor. I keep in my own mind, because these are my own experiences, I'm just keep thinking of the 1%ers where the system is set up in their favor. Amazon not paying taxes. It's just so insane. The bailouts with the COVID, these billionaires who took the emergency relief funding, like just the greed and the gall of these things. 2008, the world economy almost fell through, principally because of corrupt, selfish bankers, right? And just this unbelievable greed and inequality. If we go back to Nietzsche a bit, there's a sense that life is violence. Life is a will to power. Life is difficult. Pacifism or non-violence, in Fanon's thinking, is a creation of those in power to keep us enslaved. And say it again. Non-violence or pacifism is a way to keep us docile, to keep us subjugated. Life is a dog-eat-dog reality. You will not go out in nature and find charity or goodness of heart or equality brought about because of conversation. Why would we think that humans are any different? There's a sort of a social Darwinianism here at hand, a brutality that he's kindling because he's fed up. He's obviously fed up with just the lies, the hypocrisy, and whatnot. And so he goes to violence as a natural restorative action a necessary one, he believes. Populism, these movements in which the average person feels like the person they're voting for is easily understandable, that they relate to them, that they're going to change the system. Donald Trump as an example. These are all fueled, or this movement is fueled by a sense that this person gets me, and this person will help restore some sense of equality, that I will get what I deserve. But it doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen because usually the people who are running for office are already well-to-do and wealthy, or millionaires, billionaires. They represent an uneven playing field. They've lived it their whole lives. I feel bad going after Trump again, but if the New York Times reporting is correct, he had over $400 million given to him by his father. He has lived a life of luxury from the very beginning and largely squandered it. The idea that he understood the average person and could bring some sort of restorative justice was so outrageous from the beginning. But that's the sale, that the people in power sell themselves to us as feeling our pain or feeling the needs that we truly have, that they can make it better for all of us. But they embody that bankrupt, enslaving morality. They're the reason the problem exists. And so we have the same thing with the Enlightenment principles that say universal rationality, everybody can participate in this. But as we've seen with Said and others, the truth is they don't really think that. It's a party line to get us to buy in so they can get more wealth and they can get more power. And we're suckers when we keep believing them. We need to call these people out for what they are. The exploitive class, the elite class that doesn't have a clue what it means to really work for $1 or to go hungry or to live your life knowing that you probably will never have a mortgage-free house and your kid's education probably might not happen. I actually worry about that stuff far too much. I need to find I worry about that stuff too much. But again, why does Fanon think he needs killing, murder, violence? I mean, like straight up murder, the killing of people who don't ask for it, innocent people. Why does he need the killing and the violence? Martin Luther argued for peaceful protest. That's one of the hallmarks. Peaceful protest. Don't pick up arms. Don't become an animal to get your message heard. Be civilized. And in fact, be civilized in contrast to the police who are barbaric. That contrast between the one who's being called less than, be called less human, acting more civilized against those who represent the law, that represent equality, that represent usually middle-class white people or above, that contrast is stark, and it works, and it makes us think. Malcolm X, by contrast, was in favor of arming black people, setting up a separate state. So people look at him and then like, okay, yes, there may have been, might not agree with everything he said, but so how do you make sense of these two figures? Is one right contextually? Are they both right? Is one just flat out wrong? What we can say in the very least, I mean, Fanon is obviously the most extreme, but what we can say in the very least is that equality is a promise that has not arrived. The standard methods have not worked, and people are going hungry. People are unable to afford, well, they can in Canada because we have a social welfare network. We have healthcare. Right? We make sure that people are provided for. But there are people dying right now who have no health insurance, that can't afford insulin. These sorts of things, we need to wake up to that's a reality, that real, practical, tangible things are happening because equality hasn't arrived. And so, up with violence, we pick up our arms. We don't need to worry that we're regressing, that we're becoming barbaric. We're justified in this because we're fighting for genuine fairness. We're fighting for humanity in these violent acts. Violence can be cleansing, it can be unifying. Fanon points out that it can be quite unifying, that at least people are acting. Imagine living your whole life, again, a black guy in the street in the hoodie, always being kind of, people are pointing at you, or people are scared of you, or they're locking your doors, and you don't know how to respond, you don't know what to do. At least through violence, Fanon argues, they're able to get some sense of relief. Even if it means their own death, at least their final moments, they're living some kind of relief. Okay, again, not sure what to do with that. Those in power are happy to say, I'm sorry, and to ask for forgiveness, and to give even more promises that things will change, as long as we stay submissive. As long as, I say we, but I'm part of the problem, like so many, as long as we stay submissive, as long as we remain a part of the system and don't truly disrupt the apple cart, truly disrupt the boat, then they can say all kinds of things until we come for their money. And this is the stuff conversation that we've been having. And I know I talk a lot about stuff and money, but isn't that really what it's all about? Getting more wealth and luxury and prestige? Isn't that really what's at heart here? Imagine for a moment we're in a Star Trek universe. If you haven't seen Star Trek, it's a futuristic portrayal of humanity where mostly, for the most part, disease and death done away with. People don't really need to strive after money. Everybody gets enough food and shelter. Nobody needs to worry about any of those things anymore. Would we still have a Donald Trump billionaire class or trillionaire class like Jeff Bezos will soon be? Would we still have that in a world where everybody was still fed? The thinking that allows that to happen is that somehow the accumulation of wealth is of its own value, its own benefit. Why? And why would I kill people when they come for it? If I have very little, that makes sense. If I have very little food, that makes sense. But if I have billions and trillions, am I willing to exploit an entire generation of people to maintain that? What do I make of Fanon's analysis of the necessity of violence for equality? Well, let me go over some points I agree with. I agree with the inherent hypocrisy of the whole situation, of saying one thing but doing another, of saying we want equality, that we want to restore a system of balance and fairness, and yet when I get into office and I do my thing because I've been elected in a position of power, I do the opposite and tear people down. I perpetuate inequality. I give a bunch of money to people who are already wealthy. That's pretty obvious for most of us, that inherent hypocrisy. I understand the drive to talk as utterly disingenuous for some people in power. It's not just that their actions betray them. It's, if you listen to them, they don't really seem to care. It's lip service, in other words. So we see the lip service everywhere. That seems to be pretty obvious. That the divide remains, that's a little harder to see, but I, again, completely agree that if you look just a little bit outside of your comfort zone, if you come from a fairly wealthy place, it's not hard to find rampant poverty and inequality and people going hungry. We see this with COVID, how many people quickly ran out of money, how many people quickly couldn't afford their homes. They were already on destitute's door kind of thing, and this was all it took to push them over the edge. Of course, we have other examples of us, of that as well. The us and them based on race and economic standing, of course. That people would kill you rather than give up their stuff seems pretty obvious. And I mean, it can be as trite as, oh, I want that baseball hat, so I'm going to beat you up and take your baseball hat. Or I want another $1 billion, so I'm going to continue to exploit the people who work for me. There's a pretty extreme difference there. I've already made it clear that there are a number of things I have a problem with. I have a problem thinking that violence is necessary. And again, it might just be because I really don't understand. I'm not able to understand what it means to live in the native town. I understand not liking a system, but I don't understand the need to take a bomb into a cinema and set it off. Real laws, real opportunities, real changes have happened, have changed without violence. Martin Luther King, right? Things happened without violence. Gandhi, things happened without violence. Fanon's counter-argument would be those were incremental, those were sort of scraps from under the table, that the real inequality remains and is perpetuated. Okay, so we can see where that would go. At the end of the day, I do not believe it's putting lipstick on a pig to strive for dialogue and conversation. I will argue that in many ways it's harder to find dialogue and conversation than it is to set off a bomb or beat people and explosive violence, because you have to change people's minds, you have to challenge their belief systems, and I don't know if that's always possible. So I empathize with that idea that, well, then what's the next step? What do you do next? But still, I have to believe that Fanon is wrong. I hope he's wrong. Maybe that's a better way to phrase it. Glen Coulthard, Red Skin, White Masks. He's taking his title largely, one of Fanon's other famous texts was called Black Skin, White Masks. So calling his book Red Skin, White Masks is a way of a shout out to Fanon. What does decolonization look like? He's going to rely on Nietzsche a little bit and the conversation about ressentiment or resentment. And so see that video if you haven't already. The argument from Coulthard is that people keep talking about reconciliation, but its very meaning and how that should be achieved is fundamentally flawed. Joining people, finding equality, finding a greater health of relationship, whatever that might mean, there's a barrier. There's something preventing this from happening. So in the very process of people thinking they're trying to achieve it, they may be perpetuating its impossibility. You follow? In the very act of let's reconcile, let's come together, the misunderstanding of what reconciliation involves may actually be preventing a genuine or deeper sense of it happening. The context for his conversation is one in which there's a sort of historical amnesia. People tend to forget their history, especially when it doesn't look very good. Here's an example. Stephen Harper, our Prime Minister. In 2008, Stephen Harper said the following: "The Government of Canada sincerely apologizes and asks the forgiveness of the Aboriginal peoples of this country for failing them so profoundly." End quote. We're very sorry. Speaking from the government, we're very sorry. We're asking your forgiveness for failing you. We did something wrong. We're sorry. The next year, 2009, a quote from Stephen Harper: "We also have no history of colonialism. So we have all of the things that many people admire about great powers, but none of the things that threaten or bother them." End quote. I'm taking these out of context, obviously. You would have to have a whole conversation around, what was he saying, where was he going? But the basic point here seems to be largely true. Lip service about being sorry and forgiveness, acknowledging a wrong, but simultaneously forgetting that it happened. This is the context for Coulthard here. We say there's a problem, but it's in the past, not in the present. We acknowledge that maybe something happened, but then we also forget that something happened, so maybe it didn't. And then we move on. So what was he apologizing for? He's apologizing for something that didn't happen? They didn't do any wrong? There wasn't colonization? Right, of course. The hypocrisy of wanting your cake, but wanting to eat it too. You can't eat a cake and keep your cake at the same time, Stephen Harper. The other elephant in the room in this conversation is the residential school system. And for those who may not be familiar with how Canada treated its Indigenous people, this is one of the great dramas of Canadian history that should raise some sense of nausea and disdain and anger. I think you should be rightly angry at this. So there are a number of schools funded by the Canadian government. They were run by Canadian, but Christian churches. Unfortunately, these schools were highly underfunded. Roughly 30% or 150,000 children, over 100 years, 150,000 children were forcibly taken from their homes and put in these schools to be purposefully colonized in a way, to be purposefully taken out of their culture and taught English and French and integrated into the real world. It was supposed to be well intended. These people are not mainstream culture. They're going to have a hard, they're not going to get any kind of job. They can't even speak the language. Let's get these kids and bring them into the mainstream culture. They'll have new opportunities. They'll get educated. They'll learn about history. It's a win-win-win. But to do this, we have to get rid of their old language, their own values, and we need to give them ours. Because after all, ours are better. That's that whole enlightenment bias. We're more rational, we're more scientific, we're more whatever. In the Canadian residential school system, roughly 6,000 children died while residents. There was malnourishment, there was abuse, there was sexual abuse, some were even beaten to death. Again, it was born of a desire of good intent, but that good intent was by people really willing to act like bad people, to be the savages they thought they were saving. You see the irony there. So when they got to the schools, of course, we're talking about generational damage now. I cannot imagine someone coming to my home and taking my children and saying, you know what, we're doing this for the good of your children, and I may never see them again. The anger and the hostility that would bring up inside of me. And Coulthard is going to say, yeah, and rightly so. And you shouldn't feel guilty for being angry and having some sense of resentment. Now, it should fuel you to do something about it, but don't let people tell you anger is counterproductive. There's a very good reason why people are angry today. The history of Canada is not a pretty one. Oh, sure, maybe by the numbers we're better than many other countries, but there's more than enough guilt to go around from our government officials who made these decisions. The average Canadian today, I do not believe they would make these decisions. Not at all. But that's not the point. The point is, in recent history, there are stories of colonialism, this perpetuation of an us and a them, and suffering, legitimate human suffering done by the powers, government powers that be. Well, now we're in the, it's a modern era. Let's reconcile, goes the argument. Let's make things better between a very fractured people. Well, how do we do that? The very idea of reconciliation is problematic. Here are three initial things to get us thinking. First, he argues that reconciliation might mean establishing a positive relation to the self through recognition by the other. You can think of this in terms of talk therapy. If I just give you the space to speak your truth, to speak the issues that have come up, to just talk about the struggles that you've had in a culture run by people like me, if I give you that sense of openness and honesty, that I'm treating you like a human being, I'm giving you voice. There's a sort of equality now where to be heard, someone else has to listen. So for you to speak, to find that freedom of that psychoanalysis, or the psychotherapy, to find that freedom of health of some way, there needs to be somebody listening, and that somebody can't just be another person struggling. It has to be a certain society, certain people out there. The problem with that is that if we want colonized indigenous people to heal, that doesn't seem to be the whole story. If we emphasize, let's say you're First Nations person, and you're sitting on the couch in a therapeutic setting, and you want to talk about the issues, and you want to reconcile, and I'm the colonizer, I'm the white guy, I'm the therapist listening to you, I might really be listening to you, but when do I start saying, and yeah, there's another side to this story, which is I haven't been listening to you, I haven't been there when you needed me, you're in your 40s now or something, and I've ignored you your whole life. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you earlier, and I'm sorry for what happened in the past. In other words, the sense of healing that comes about through recognition by the other can't arrive when the other sees the issues as something that happened only in the past. That colonization happened a long time ago, and that the modern period right now, basically, you know what? Just get over it. Just get over what happened, and then we'll be reconciled. That kind of reconciliation of having a positive relationship with the other can't arrive if everybody's fixated on, you should just get over it happened in the past. A second version of reconciliation is overcoming anger to forge a new sense of unity. The division that we just see these divisions that need to be fixed, bridged, healed. But again, if the two need to be reconciled, this implies that both sides are at fault. Well, think about that for a second. Are both sides really at fault in the context of the indigenous community of Canada and the colonizing government that did the residential school systems? Like, should we expect the parents of these children or the children themselves to be asking forgiveness of the government? No, that's insane. To have unity, we need to be careful that we're not implying equal guilt, because it is clearly not the case. The government, the history of Canada, even recent history in the government of Canada, is far more guilty, vastly more guilty. So that sense of equality there is misplaced equality. It's not a shared burden of responsibility, or at least it shouldn't be. There's a huge disparity. A third way of thinking about reconciliation is to make things consistent. That is, everybody in Canada is treated consistently or the same way. Really, what that means and why it's problematic is that everything is consistent in the sense that Canada has absolute power over all territories. It's consistent that the federal government has the same amount of power over Ontario as it does the reserves in Ontario. But the Indigenous population of Canada is supposed to have a sovereign territory, to have say over how its land, how its people operate. So if it's really consistency that it's looking for, and sameness, then it's really looking for power. It's looking for control in a way. That can't work. If reconciliation is the federal government gets to make the decisions carte blanche for all people in Canada, that's the wrong kind of reconciliation. That's the wrong kind of moving forward. There's a problem created with this push to think of reconciliation or a positive, productive relationship going forward as something that means letting the past go. It dismisses the people in the present who have had legitimate experiences of being enslaved, for a better word, that need to be respected. It flies in the face of people who don't have equal power before the law. It flies in the face of people who don't have equal opportunity right here, right now, right here in your context where you are. And so, because often the damage that the government addresses and asks forgiveness for and spends money to correct are the negative repercussions of what happened in the past, instead of thinking about how it can fix things in the present in terms of a genuine relationship with people. What might that mean? Reconciliation that involves accepting or recognizing or just allowing a space for people to be angry is a positive step forward. When someone's angry and resentful, don't dismiss that as, just a negative, immature response of something that's out of place and that really just belongs in history. Is it possible, he's asking us to think, is it possible, he thinks it is, that anger and resentment are appropriate responses to the ongoing colonization or the ongoing inequalities that exist right now? And his answer is yes, absolutely. But it's a kind of anger or resentment that doesn't petrify you or set you in stone or stop you. It's something that's supposed to be liberatory, that is supposed to give you action or a motive to move forward instead of recoiling and just accepting your fate and the system doesn't like me, I'll just be sad. No, anger and resentment fuel revolution and change. One of the things that makes the idea of reconciliation very difficult in Canada, this is in contrast to something like South Africa, is that reconciliation has never had a coming of age, so to say. In South Africa, when democracy hit, we have South Africa, we have this widespread population, people being enslaved and subjected, they're not equal before the law, And then all of a sudden the laws change and democracy comes about. The majority of people who lived in South Africa were black. And so they suddenly had power, and that was reconciliation in a way. There was a legitimate revolution where suddenly you could have a black president, whereas before you couldn't. In Canada, however, the indigenous population has never been the majority, and there's never been this democracy suddenly arising and them being able to have power. There's always been a sense of trying to get as much self-determination as possible in the context of a culture that's not really interested in giving it to you. The idea of reconciliation points us in the direction of a new world, a better world, a healthier world, and it's encouraged, its possibility is made more manifest, Coulthard believes, in the acceptance of anger or resentment, or I don't want to use the word bitterness, but the thing that gets you going. And he looks at different kinds of anger. So just in a very preliminary way, let me just give you some of the stages of anger. The argument is that anger often starts internally. I hate me maybe, I hate my culture, I hate my setting, I hate being poor, okay. So it's sort of a negative, pulling everything down, very pessimistic. That is not the kind of anger you want to live in. It's natural to feel that way. It's, happenstance, sucks, coincidence that, life is just terrible for me, whatever, and I hate it. But you need to move on from that, and hopefully you'll emerge to a healthier form of anger. The second one is anger that you turn outward. This is maybe the scapegoating, or not the scapegoating, but there's just an externalized sense of, I'm not happy. It wasn't coincidence that brought me here. It was a lot of you people forcing me here. It wasn't happenstance that I'm poor. It turns out that there's a system in place that very much wants me to be poor, because then the millionaires and the billionaires can make lots of money. So now actually I'm not so much mad at me. I'm not happy with you, and you start to get angry with you. There's a third layer of anger now. It's sort of, we're maturing as we go here. We're maturing as a people, as individuals, but as a people as well. And the third one, quote, is a recovery of lost culture, quote, then the colonized rediscover and celebrate their culture, rejecting the colonial culture that has been forced upon them, end quote. So there's this third stage now where I was angry at me. Wait, now I realize now I'm angry at you, but I'm going to go one step further and do something productive with it and rediscover or recreate or find meaning in my culture. So anger becomes a process of discovery, of self-realization. I know that sounds like a cliche, a self-realization, but that's what's supposed to be happening now. As an example to tie all of this together, one of the great historical events in Canada that led to a great deal of self-realization for many Indigenous peoples in Canada, but also an understanding of the inequality that existed just among the general public, was in 1990, the Oka crisis in Quebec. So it was a town, Oka. And basically what happened is that, was it 1717, the lands were granted to the people, the Mohawk people in that area. They had long fought for recognition that the land was theirs, and it had long been theirs. In fact, there was actually a burial site there. And 1990, just before 1990, there was a sense, oh, you know what, for the local people, this is open forest, the pines, let's just go there and make a golf course. And I think they initially did a 9-hole golf course, and they were going to do an 18-hole golf course, and they were going to put a bunch of condominiums. So the average, the idea, I think, people who like the money, we all like money, but the people who like the money decide, well, this is one way to make more money, let's just get rid of the forest. And the Indigenous population say, hey, wait, whoa. Initially, they went to their local politicians. They went through the correct routes to say that this is inappropriate. Look, this is sacred land, obviously. We have people buried here. It wasn't in dispute. None of that was in dispute. But it fell on deaf ears. People weren't willing to have that conversation. Remember my earlier argument through Fanon that money speaks louder than human worth. Money speaks louder than decency, than respect, than conversation. This is an example of that. Money. So forget their ancestral land. We're going to go ahead. You can try and negotiate, but when it comes to money and stuff, don't bother. Lo and behold, the subsequent protests and the blockade on the road were met with hostility from the locals, and the police were sent in, and police in riot gear. So not just your average police, but automatic weapons kind of thing. And firefight broke out. They had thrown some canisters of gas and I think some concussion grenades. And the protesters shot back, and one of the officers was killed. Interesting. In a day and age where there wasn't social media, this made national and international news very quickly. People standing up, willing to engage in violence in the name of demanding some recognition. They weren't hoping to achieve equality, obviously, but some sense of equality, getting closer to it. You can probably guess what happened next, right? The people who had ignored them decided, you know what, we need to sit down and have a conversation with the leaders. So they sat down and they had a good conversation, and everybody had a meeting of the minds, and everybody got what they wanted. No, they sent in the military. Right, because those people were clearly a very large armed force that were going to take over the town of Oka, and we needed to send in the military. Why send in the police with riot gear, concussion grenades, gas grenades? That's weird. But then why send in the military? Because when people in power are challenged and the conversation has already ended, the pretend conversation ended a long time ago, then not even having a conversation, well, that part ended. And so they go right to violence. They go right to violence. Of course. Police officer was shot first. In the end, there were no more deaths. There was stabbing. There was violence of different kinds. But it set the agenda for an entire generation of thinkers to ask the question, why? What's going on here? So it brought to awareness, a consciousness that inequality was still rampant. It brought to the fore that conversation and dialogue between those who have not and those who do have is a bit of a pipe dream. And as a result, the golf courses were never created, the condominiums were never created. Well, that's because the people with the money felt bad about it all. No, that's not why. It's because it became too expensive, and the public outcry that enraged the nation, the average person didn't know. And when they saw what was going on, when they heard about it, the average person was deeply upset about it. Is reconciliation possible? Reconciliation is possible when we look at the other person and we allow them to be a full person. The right to self-determination, the right to act and to live and to be and to do what they want. All of us are governed by some kind of rules. That's true. We can't just all be completely antinomian, lawless, doing whatever we want. We're all governed by something. But in this case, when the Canadian government wants to maintain control over a people who have from the very beginning been obligated, we were obligated to give them their own sovereignty. But when the government wants to maintain control, reconciliation can't happen. And Coulthard argues that they have the right to be angry and resentful because even to this day, whether it's the Indian Act, laws that tell how the government should relate to the indigenous population, whether it's public consensus, public bias, public prejudice, that these things are in the past, we shouldn't worry about them, whatever, all of this makes the idea of reconciliation very, very difficult. So I step back and I try and put myself in the shoes of Fanon and Coulthard, and I try to understand, what are these people saying? What I hear is a desperation in a way that of available alternatives, the universal enlightenment rationality is not one of them. A belief in conversation or dialogue is kind of pessimistic at best, given the routine failure of the people in power to hear or to be engaged in a meaningful way. I hear that the recourse to violence isn't something anybody wants, but it's necessary. And I hear that autonomy, self-ownership, is always being juxtaposed to wealth and stuff. Where a golf course is in question, the military and the police can be sent in. because a people has challenged, they dared challenge their obvious right and ownership of that land. It's a messed up situation. So what do we do with these conversations about racism that we've been having, thinking through Louverture, Said, Fanon, Coulthard? I don't know what to do about racism, honestly, but I have, in a positive way, come away with a number of new questions. Many of my biases and prejudices are going to be challenged, obviously. And going forward, I'm far more sensitive to some of the possible experiences of others that I myself have never experienced. I'm more aware of the extraordinary inequality. I'm more aware of the human cost of capitalism and the power structures that we have around us, and being more mindful of the human cost of these kinds of things and the contemporary nature of the cost being paid. And hopefully that will make me a better person in relation to others. And I think that's probably the best case scenario, and that would spread. They would all begin to treat one another with a greater sense of humanity and equality and fairness, knowing that our own experiences are very limited and that we need to use sometimes our imagination to understand the genuine plight of those around us that we do not understand.